I am Pati, and I will be your technology facilitator, as well as a speaker in this session. Please let me know if you have any questions or difficulties. You are in the Equity and Ethics Considerations for AI session, which is an expertise connection session. It was designed to have for leaders in the Circles community with expertise on a topic to share information and examples with participants who want to learn more about the topic, and also to provide a forum for participants to discuss how they might incorporate the topic into their work. And thirdly, to broker connections between community members around a topic. As you go through this session, I hope you get a chance to learn and think about what to take to the strategy sessions tomorrow, where we will start to make plans for how we can remake broadening. I know people are still coming in, but I am going to go ahead and turn it over to Marcelo, and Michael will be sharing some slides, and we will go from there. Marcelo?
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. And we'll get started in just a second.
You all see that? Is that working?
Yeah, I think it's up.
Glad to be back on Zoom in a weird way.
Okay. So thank you guys for coming and joining in this expertise connection section. We're thinking about equity and ethics considerations in AI. We're going to start off with just a handful of presentations, just to kind of situate some of this work and situate some of the ways that we're thinking about it. We can go and go to the next slide. So I'm going to mostly be talking about really thinking about this pathway, this pipeline of multimodal data collection, analysis, and dissemination, and really thinking about the ways that we can explore and really try to enact ethical and equitable practices across this space. So go to the next slide. Did it skip a slide or no?
Yeah, sorry, I think my computer is lagging a little bit, but I think it's...
Okay, can you go back one more? There we go. So a lot of the stuff I'm going to talk about is actually from a paper that should be coming out soon in the Journal of Learning Analytics, entitled New Era in Multimodal Learning Analytics, 12 Core Commitments to Ground and Grow MMLA. We can go to the next slide. The big sort of takeaways that I would sort of suggest from this little section we're going to talk about is really about being intentional and to not feign this idea that AI is neutral. I think that can be one of the things that kind of gets us into trouble. Go to the next slide. The other real takeaway is it lag a little bit. Is really to be intentional. And to be intentional all across all aspects of your research projects. And that's why today I'm going to touch on, we can go to the next slide, touch on a few, what I think about as commitments. Other people might think of these as principles or sort of core ideas across data collection, data analysis, and data dissemination and feedback, or research dissemination and feedback, that I think can help promote more equitable and ethical practices as we're trying to use AI. I'm not going to touch on all these right now. We're going to do some breakout sessions later on. And so people who are interested in talking about some of these in more detail can come and join that breakout session. But sort of high level, when you think about data collection, and I'll mention a couple of these, multimodality, which is really around recognizing the various ways that people might demonstrate their expertise and knowledge. Expansive learning experiences, which is really trying to create a variety of ways for people to engage in learning. Making learners' complexity visible. And so realizing that sometimes within our systems, when you only surface certain types of information, we're actually missing out on a lot of the sort of competencies that they might be demonstrating. There's a principle around learning across spaces and thinking about the ways that we may be biased in what we see based on the spaces, based on the learning environments that people are in. And then multimodal data control, which is really about letting participants own their data. Instead of having a centralized organization own them, really put the data in the hand of the participants. And I'll go into more detail on a couple of these in the upcoming slides. You can go to the next slide. Just going to touch on 2 core commitments from each section. Go to the next slide. On data collection, go ahead, next one. Within data collection, the 2 I'm going to talk about is this idea that students demonstrate and communicate knowledge, interests, intent, and through a plurality of modalities. This is the one I was mentioning earlier around multimodality. And so one of the ways to really kind of be ethical and equitable in the ways that we employ and really support these learning environments is to recognize the fact that when we only focus on a single modality, let that be written, let that just be speech, that we're actually doing things that aren't necessarily providing for a very equitable experience. Next slide. The other one I'll talk about under data collection is really this idea of let's let research participants be the ones who control their data control their data. And now, if people come to the breakout room, one thing you'll note is like this adds some new challenges. And when we think about the types of algorithms or even the types of analytic approaches that we might use with our data. But this is one of the other principles, sort of commitments that I suggest would sort of really be helpful in trying to promote equity and ethics within AI. We can go to the next section. We're going to now move into data analysis and inference. And I'm going to mention 2 here. Go to the next slide. The first one is really to kind of be thorough, consistent, and really transparent in the way that we're modeling data. So in this specific slide, I'm showing 2 different ways to think about engagement. In one case, you're using multimodal data to just look for, is somebody engaged? Are they doing something? And that can be gesturally, that can be based on biosensor data. And in the other case, maybe it's based on them talking. Versus a different sort of conceptualization of engagement that is really typified by certain types of speech, certain types of audio generation. Maybe it's generating a lot of audio, having very low biosensor data, and having a lot of gesturing. But that when we use AI, when we use multimodal data, we really kind of want to be, again, thorough, consistent, and transparent in how we're actually representing and modeling what it means or what we say when we're talking about a certain type of engagement. And those choices that we make have a really big impact on the type of inferences and analyses that follow. Go ahead and go to the next slide. The next one is really this, I call it this limitations and prediction from multimodal data. The big idea is that a person's behavior does not define their identity, right? We collect data. We have maybe an algorithm that comes up with some quote unquote predicted label about someone's behavior. But we as researchers need to make sure that we're separating that from their identity. Just because someone got a low score on an assessment, just because someone did not look like they were engaged during a given classroom experience, does not mean that they need to be defined as a low achiever or that they need to be defined as someone who has someone that is of low engagement. So I think we need to think about when we're using these predicted labels from machine learning or even from our own observations, that we're careful about distinguishing the behaviors from the identities. And then also recognize that these oftentimes are just predicted labels, and make sure that we don't sort of fall into this trap of thinking that those things are necessarily sort of ground truths. Go to the next slide. We'll skip this one and just go on to the last set around feedback and dissemination. Go to the next one. So 2 of the ideas here are really around transparency and benefit. And one of the things that I sort of suggest is that when we design these systems, in addition to using the AI or using data mining to collect data about participants, also want to suggest that we do things that actually provide tangible benefits to the participants. So in these 2 slides or these 2 pictures, you're actually seeing multimodal systems that are there to actually enhance the learning experience and actually improve, in one case, collaboration, and in the other case, to actually facilitate student learning. So just to say that, there's a lot that we can do with AI in terms of mining students' data, but to also suggest that we really should be doing more to make sure that participants are deriving benefits from those experiences, and they're getting those benefits as quickly as possible. And oftentimes that can be embedded into the multimodal interface. Okay, next slide. And the last idea, and this is very similar to the previous, is that the data that we collect and really the output of the data should be something that can be interpreted and used even for non-data savvy users. right? That we want to make sure that what we're producing is not just for researchers. And so this really kind of goes hand in hand with the previous suggestion, but to really make sure that we, the analytics that we might display are actually well connected to that context. So we can go to the next slide. So that's just a sort of a highlight of some of the different commitments that are sort of put forth that I think can help promote more equitable and ethical practices as we use artificial intelligence within learning. And really just had these same as takeaways beforehand, is really realizing intentionality across all elements of our projects in terms of data collection, in terms of data analysis, and also within the dissemination feedback. Go to the next slide. But this just touches on, part of the process, right? And I think some of the, so I think Michael, Patti, and Ryan are gonna talk about some of the other ways that we might think about, really think about the use of AI and really think about ethics within this space. And some of those might be around really using AI to expose bias or injustice. None of that is, really within thinking about the design, the data collection, data analysis, or inference per se. The ideas of youth leveraging AI as designers and creators and thinking about what that looks like. And similarly, thinking about AI as a means to promote more equitable learning spaces and opportunities. And maybe that's in the case of creating new sorts of multimodal interfaces that are going to promote accessibility. So just to say that, a lot of what I've really been trying to highlight is the opportunities to embed equity and ethics throughout the sort of data analysis or the research pipeline. But then to also suggest that I think there are some other ways that we can also think about this work that are orthogonal or taken from a different perspective. And that is what some of the other presenters are going to talk about. So you can go to the next slide. I think that'll turn it over to Ryan. Go ahead, next one.
Hi, I'm Ryan Baker, and I'll talk a little bit about algorithmic bias in education. Marcelo, thank you for that lead-in. It's such exciting work you're doing, so important, so thank you. To talk about some of our work in collaboration with Aaron Hahn. So what do we know about algorithmic bias in education? To a great degree, we don't know very much, and I'll talk about kind of how little we know. And that's a problem because if we want to achieve equity or even equality over at the far right here, we first need to be able to develop systems that are at least fair. And in order to do that, we need to know what the system's biases are. And right now we're at a problem where we don't even know what all the biases in our existing systems are. So that's what I'll talk about here. Beep. So what do we know about bias impacting learners in common demographic categories? Most educational data mining research and learning analytics research doesn't even mention learner demographics, much less do research on differential effectiveness for students of different demographics. For example, if we look at the evidence around race and ethnicity, there's only been a small number of studies that have looked at it. These studies have generally found that algorithms perform worse for students who are historically underrepresented. One important note down at the bottom is that a lot of people's solution to algorithmic bias, to algorithms working less effectively for members of some demographics than others, is to say, oh, well, let's put demographics into our model. Let's make a model that says, well, if you're of this race, then here's your risk. And if you're of this race, here's your risk. Not only is that, I think, deeply problematic in several ways. I mean, it creates models that explicitly discriminate, are explicitly designed to discriminate, but it also doesn't work as well, according to you et al.'s work. It leads to less effective prediction than other approaches. Go on. In terms of nationality, there's been a few studies that have found, for example, that systems for automated essay scoring often do less well for students from specific nationalities. That models built on students from one nationality work less well from students from another nationality. And in particular, that models generated on US data often work less well for students in less economically developed countries. For gender, there's been a lot of studies. And what's interesting about the studies in gender, looking at algorithmic bias in terms of gender in education, is that the findings aren't entirely consistent in direction. Across many studies, there's evidence that models work better or worse for males or females but it's not consistent. That depends often on what the circumstances are in the specific situation being studied. So I've kind of briefly summarized a few studies, very briefly, around race, nationality, and gender. What do we know about bias impacting other variables in terms of identity? There's insufficient research, and there needs to be more. We don't even know necessarily about all the groups that are being impacted. You go on. For example, in terms of native language and dialect, algorithmic essay scoring typically is being developed on corpuses that are more relevant to native speakers than second language speakers. In terms of dialect, there's been no work on algorithmic bias in education that I'm aware of in terms of learner dialect. There has been work to develop learning systems that are appropriate for speakers of non-traditional dialect, such as Finkelstein and Cassell's work, but not to see whether other systems are working less effectively, quietly, for learners with non-mainstream or non-privileged dialects. In terms of disabilities, one study by Lukina and colleagues showed that speech recognition systems being used in educational assessment were much less accurate for students with speech impairments. There's also been some evidence that course outcome prediction doesn't work as well for students who self-report that they have disability. But that's it. That's the evidence so far. We need to do so much more to explore the impact of different disabilities on the accuracy of the algorithms we're using to make predictions. Urbanicity. In terms of models of emotion, some research shows that models of emotion are less effective when you transfer them between urban, rural, and suburban students. Another study looking at the attributes of student questions showed that accuracy wasn't impacted by urban, rural, suburban differences. So it looks like there's some contexts, and actually the Okampa et al. Study was replicated by Karumbaya et al. There's some contexts where urbanicity matters, others where it doesn't. Parental education background. A few studies showing that models are more or less accurate depending on parents' educational background. Socioeconomic status. A few studies showing that models are less accurate if they're transferred between schools with different socioeconomic status on average, and that models are more likely to inaccurately predict negative outcomes from students from poorer families. Mild evidence, a little bit of evidence of algorithmic bias involved for international students, specifically if international student status is included in the model. And one study showing that military connected status is associated. Children who have parents in the military, models predicting high school dropout are less accurate for them if those models are developed on schools where the students are mostly not military connected. So there's strong evidence that bias impacts a wide range of groups and a wide range of demographic variables, but it's likely that other groups not yet studied are also impacted. Who on this Zoom meeting thought that military connected students would be one of the groups we'd be seeing evidence for? You know, it probably wouldn't have been studied if there wasn't specific funding to look for that. Go on. So other takeaways, you know, overall from this research, models trained on one group of learners generally perform more poorly for new groups. There's investigation of bias for many groups of learners still needed. Across those previous studies, there's very limited work on Indigenous learners. Just one work by Anderson and colleagues that actually ended up observing that there wasn't enough data to really look for differences in model quality for Indigenous learners. Looking into specific disabilities, looking into non-binary and transgender learners and their experiences, religious minorities. These are topics that algorithmic bias in education, looking whether educational algorithms work less well for one group and another, hasn't even been conducted at all, as far as we're aware. And clearly collecting and training on a diverse sample of students can help, but we need to have an idea about what forms of diversity we need to be looking at in our data sets. So to a small extent, we're starting to move from unknown bias to known bias. There's still a great distance to fairness and to equity. Go on, please. Go on. A couple key obstacles to overcoming these forms of bias: lack of data on group membership and lack of transparency on bias and group specific outcomes. In particular, oftentimes increasingly there's pressure against developers of educational systems to actually have demographic data, which is a problem if we wanted to make sure that our algorithms aren't biased. There's also increasing interest in demonstrating efficacy, but often in very general terms. Go on. Some potential steps: improving our data collection to understand how much data we need for learners in different groups and make sure we collect it. Improving the tools and resources for checking for algorithmic bias in education. Facilitating and incentivizing openness. Right now, there's a strong disincentive for a company to be the first one to publish data on algorithmic bias in their system compared to their competitors. Their competitors are going to just be so excited by that to be able to tell all the customers, hey, this other system is biased, and ours, well, we haven't looked at it, so it must be good. Broaden the community and increase the number of voices. These are a few steps we could take. There's probably others, and I look forward to discussing them together in the breakout room. Thank you very much.
And I'm going to be talking a little bit about considering tools for learning and specifically taking into account the educators and the students that these tools are being designed for. Next slide, Michael. Who are we designing these tools for? As a former teacher, I think a lot about how these tools are designed to support teachers, but in many ways can miss the point when it comes to what supports teachers need. And so this is an example of someone posting a tweet about what needs to happen for teachers to be able to use a tool effectively. In this case, giving teachers an access to a student view is very important. Likewise, giving teacher coaches views where they can see what teachers are seeing. And so ensuring that these tools are really supporting teachers and their students so that we can be responsive and sensitive to the needs of those teachers and students is something I think about a lot. And I hope that we will discuss in the breakout group that I will be in. Next slide, please. In terms of when it comes to COVID-19, one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is how these tools are being brought into the classroom and sometimes haven't been fully thought out or have been introduced without really a full understanding of what these tools are. But this article described some potential solutions for some of the problems brought in with COVID-19 artificial intelligence solutions. And those included demanding transparency and explanation of the AI systems, joining and promoting multidisciplinary ethics working groups or councils to inform the responses, building partnerships to fill in health data gaps in ways that really protect and empower local communities, advancing research and innovation while emphasizing diversity and inclusion, and then resisting the urge to prioritize efficiency at the cost of justice and equity, which is time consuming, but very important thing to do. On the next slide are some of the ways that we've found through the EdTech pilot framework that district leaders make decisions and purchasing decisions specifically about technologies that are coming into the classrooms. So thinking about what products are designed to do, the effectiveness of the product for the intended purpose, whether or not the product addresses educational and administrative needs in a school and district, what the student privacy features are, how it fits in with the overall IT system at a school, the skills that are required to implement, and then the ongoing technical support needed. These are some things that are considered for all technologies, but particularly when introducing AI technologies are particularly important for researchers or developers of these AI tools to be able to answer for district administrators. On the next slide, I just wanted to share a resource that I'm developing and also hope to discuss with anyone who joins the breakout group around artificial intelligence in education. And this is specifically a reading guide geared towards educators, specifically K-12 educators, and it's focused on efforts to promote equity and accountability in AI. And it I think is a good start, and I'd love to hear from this community. What else what do you think educators need to know when it comes to these topics, and what resources you would like to add or you would suggest that we add to this this compilation that has just started. So there's so many things to talk about. I'm really excited to get into breakout rooms later, but I'll turn it over to Michael so he can do his part before we go there.
Yeah, thanks, Pati. So good to hear about, all these different ways in which we can be more intentional about thinking about equity and bias up and down this AI pipeline. And I'm going to be talking about, taking a step back and thinking about how we might be able to co-vision AI possibilities with youth in the design of these technologies. So what projects are we even considering doing in the first place? So, this work for me is sort of happening in the context of the Institute for Student AI Teaming, which is one of the large AI institutes that were founded to basically, where our institute was our primary objective, or driving questions are around how to build an AI partner that helps to facilitate collaboration inside of a classroom environment. And one of our commitments from the very beginning was to basically think about how we can innovate responsibly, right? And a big part of this process is who are we including in the conversation as we are building this technology, right? Rather than just having, the typical sort of paradigm where you have a technologist that dreams of what they want to build or what's convenient in a certain situation, build whatever they want to do and inject it into certain communities, which only upholds existing biases and equities that we see in society today. How can we instead take a step back and involve a lot of different people who are impacted by these technologies right from the beginning? So we're talking about students, families, community organizations, education leaders, teachers, researchers, and across like a variety of different organizations that have been thinking about these problems for a long time. So leveraging all that insight and those personal experiences in deciding what we're going to build in the first place. So in this institute, what me, myself, Thomas Phillip, and a number of other colleagues have been thinking about is thinking about us developing a series of workshops, which we've called the Learning Future workshops. And the goals for these workshops was basically to work with a lot of young people and ask two questions. One, what are the hopes, dreams, and concerns of young people for how AI might be able to facilitate collaboration in a classroom? And in particular, we're thinking about expansive designs for AI. We want the young people to really dream and tell us what they're looking for. So just to give like a little bit of an overview of what our workshop looked like, we first took the first 2 days to introduce a little bit of machine learning literacy and also a social-political lens to technology to disrupt some of the ideologies around how technology is used and developed on people. On the next 2 days, we had a design activity where we talked about how to bridge the real to the ideal, looking at how collaboration actually looks like and sounds like today inside classrooms, thinking about how might collaboration look like ideally for these young folks, and then thinking about how do we get from the reality to the ideal and whether there's a role for AI to play in this. Because we don't want to force feed AI into these kinds of situations where, where young people really want to dream about these like ideal versions of collaboration. On the last day, we had a theatro activity in which we basically discussed how AI could step into oppressive experiences that come up in the classroom and thinking about how we might be able to imagine new and powerful metaphors that could support us in these situations. So our workshop was comprised of 28 participants. We had 6 facilitators, including 1 youth facilitator from Project Voice, which is a nonprofit in Boulder, Colorado Boulder, that works with youth in the area to lead student projects. And most of our youth came from the East Bay, Denver, and Stillwell, and Oklahoma. And one caveat is that, as you might imagine, we had this workshop was held over the summer. So as you might imagine, the youth who signed up for it were more likely to identify with school more and are like high performing on conventional measures. So it's an important caveat that, we've been thinking through as we've been looking through our video data and trying to understand this. So I wanted to present a little bit of our preliminary understandings of what's going on, but we're still I wanted to emphasize that we're still really working through this, and would love to hear your ideas too about, what's going on here. So when we asked the youth, what would an ideal collaboration look like? And when we would pose this question in sort of a general sense, we heard glimmers of youth wanting to be empowered. They wanted to be heard. They wanted to be listened to. They wanted to be supported and affirmed. They didn't want to be seen as test scores and essays. They wanted to be seen as complex humans who go to the supermarket and go to the shopping mall and likes to buy certain clothes, not just like these numbers on a piece of paper. And they wanted, academic environments that had empathy and understanding rather than deficit framings of youth of color. If someone is goofing off, why are they goofing off? Is it because they're intrinsically not interested in learning, or is there something happening back home that a teacher might want to be aware of to understand how to be able to give the youth the education that they need? So in thinking about these ideal forms of collaboration, one question that came up for us is, what is a human responsibility and when is a technical solution necessary? Are we just taking things that humans should be doing and being trained to do in classrooms and making technology do them just because it's a project that we can do or that it's something that we can get funded? Where does that line exist? And also in thinking about this, who is more likely to be benefited or harmed by these applications when we're trying to replace human responsibility with a technical solution, which just may not be as good to begin with? Which schools do they get deployed in first? These are questions that are really coming up for us as we're going through our analysis of our workshop. So with these ideal collaborations in mind, what actual AI designs do young people come up with? And we were surprised to see that the young people's dreams didn't quite line up with these ideal high-level goals, and instead it aligned more with normative education goals, in particular things around accountability and efficiency. So for example, while they said they wanted to be empowered, many young people wanted an AI that would keep them on task while collaborating on the project, which doesn't really seem to be in alignment with the goals that they had just stated. And the question that's really on our mind is that, these young people's ideal forms of collaboration really open up so many novel AI possibilities that people haven't really been thinking about as much, especially around goals of equitability. But yet the projects that they're presenting are of much different flavor. So what accounts for this discrepancy between the ideal and the design proposals that they're coming up with? And this is the question that we're trying to work through. In the meantime, where we're going next with this workshop is we're going to keep looking at this video data, and we're going to try to think about things from a more futurist perspective. What makes streaming possible about new technology in classrooms and all these constraints that these young people have. We're going to try to focus on reflection and personal familial histories. What structures and institutions do we take for granted, and what happens when we unwind them? What possibilities come up? And we're going to hope to lean on the wisdom and the brilliant literature from Afrofuturism and speculative futures, and use that to sort of maybe be a starting point for thinking about how can we open up new possibilities for technology and AI. So I'm looking forward to talking about this more with people in the breakout rooms. And I'm going to hand it back to Pati, who I think will explain the breakout rooms and send us to them.
Thank you. And I think Marcelo will be explaining. Thank you,
Yeah,
Michael.
I can jump in. So thank you guys. This is it's always fun to hear about each other's work. So we thought it'd be fun to set up 4 breakout rooms and really allow for maybe smaller group interactions and for us to kind of get to know each other again on a slightly smaller scale. The plan is we'll have about 10 minutes in each breakout room. So we're going to do 10 minutes where each one of you guys will pick a breakout room to go into. Michael's is really going to be around co-design. Mine will be around sort of multimodal data collection, analysis, and dissemination. Think about that pipeline or that research pipeline. Ryan's will be around algorithmic bias in education, related to the things that he talked about. And Pati, really around considering the tools for learning and really thinking about the needs of educators and students. So the thought is that we'll have these breakout rooms for about 10 minutes. And then we're actually going to merge some of the breakout rooms. So my breakout room will merge with Michael, and Pati will merge with Ryan. We'll be in there for a little bit. And then right around, I think 3:55, we will all reconvene back into the main room and just share out some final ideas. So feel free to go ahead and you should be able to, oh, Pati, can you, oh, great. The breakout rooms are open now. So feel free to go ahead and jump into one of those breakout rooms. And within each room, we're just going to start off with a chance for you guys to share thoughts and ideas. We have a Jamboard that we've set up. So if you want to put your ideas there, you can. But otherwise, it'll just be a chance for us to kind of go into a little bit more in-depth discussion and for people to ask more targeted questions.
And if anyone needs help joining a breakout room, please let me know. For those of you who are able to see the breakout rooms, you should see a blue number to the right of the title of the breakout room. And you can click on, hover over that number. You should be able to see join pops up. So you can join your own breakout rooms, or let me know. Oh, nobody can see them. Okay, so please go ahead and type what breakout room you'd like to go in, and I'll ask my co-host to help me add people to the correct breakout rooms. Marcelo, Brian, what do you all think? Michael, share out.
I don't know that we're gonna have time to do a full on share out. I think for our two groups, I think we encourage people to go take a look at the Jamboard, and you can see some of the ideas that that were populated on there. We shared this earlier with the group, but the hope is that during tomorrow's sessions and during the rest of today, people have a chance to think more about these things. The goal today, as I understood it, is really to start to raise some of these challenges and kind of give people an idea of the landscape. And this is not the entirety of the landscape. Like, don't deceive yourself into thinking that that's the case. But then tomorrow during the afternoon strategy sessions, it's really going to be more of a chance to hopefully sort of focus in on specific issues and think more about solutions.
Thank you. And I was just saying that we have the welcome and announcement session coming up next in 2 minutes. And that'll be back in SwapCard. You can click on the agenda and you should be able to jump right into that session. And then please note that we also have an optional after hours gathering in Wonder, which will start at 6:30, 3:30 Pacific and run for an hour and a half. It's an informal drop-in session, so you can come say hi to other participants and maybe meet someone new. The Wonder platform is a bit different than Zoom or SwapCard, but you get to the Wonder through SwapCard. So if you are in SwapCard on today's agenda, at the very end of the agenda, you should see the after hours session with the Wonder link embedded in there. Thank you everyone so much for attending. Thank you to Michael, Marcelo, and Ryan. I learned a lot in this session, and I look forward to seeing you all in other sessions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Great comments.